Well, welcome to the history of gold mining. What we have on this film, it's presented by the Gold Prospectors Association of America, and my name is George Massie. I'm your host. And what we're going to do is we're going to take you for a trip through memory lane. We're going to tell you about the gold rush, how it was back in 1849, going to California and all the way up over the Chillicothe and into the Klondike and to Nome, Alaska. Then I'm going to show you some astounding footage of the 1950s when gold mining was still being done, larger scale mining, and also how it was done by individuals. And then we're going to take a look at a film that was produced in the 1920s, actually in the gold mining, because a lot of individual gold mining was still going on as late as the 1920s. And we're going to go through this, and I think that you'll find it interesting. Those of you that are going out looking for gold, well, you can use this as part of your research, because you know us prospectors, the ones that are out looking for gold, we're all somewhat historians as well, and it's always important to do your research and to think about the things and to see some of the methods that the old-timers did it, because the old-timers were pretty sharp in their gold mining. They were not elusive at all. They had the technology worked out pretty well for the hand miner, and they did it on a shoestring. And many of us today, many a prospector today is going back and building these old rocker boxes. And I might tell you that the rocker box itself, you know, the modern day rocker box that was developed and in vogue is one with a screen in it, and it never worked well and was not popular with the miners of today until one day an old timer was sitting there and he was looking at the one of the old pictures of how the old prospectors did it on the beach in Nome, and they found that they used punch plate. And he said, well, maybe punch plate would make a difference in my rocker box. And lo and behold, they put the old type punch plate back in there, and it just made all the difference in the world. And I'll explain that as we go on through this film, and I'll talk about some of the methods that the prospectors used and how we use them today, and also about some of the history and the camaraderie of the miners. So let's roll our film now, and you sit back and enjoy, and let's take a look at what the prospectors did. Here in this scene, you saw a couple of guys using a rocker box. This is an Arasta. One fella's there panning. He would crush the ore up with the mule, and then he would test to see if there was any gold in it. These are some long toms where the guys dug out of a bank, and they had their tents there, and they come across the continent a long ways from home, and they used every kind of method for panning, and you know, just about anything will work, even a hollowed out piece of wood. The natives down in South America used bateas. This fellow's using a jackknife here because in the early days when gold was first struck in California, the guys that were working at the mills and over in the farmland, they rushed up into the Sierras, and all they had was a jackknife to work with, and they did what they call was crevicing. They had very crude tools. And then as they started finding gold, they started developing what they call long toms, and this is where they brought the material down. Here's a picture of an old rocker box, one of the early day rockers. This is some of the guys out on Sunday. This is a real famous painting by George Nall there in California. and it shows Sunday at the mines, and it was just a real famous one. This is the way that the prospector was depicted somewhat in the Eastern newspaper, the gold rushers to California. This is where the guy said you could take a rubber band and stretch it to California and sling people out there. He had Rufus Porter had quite an idea, and there's a whole story in the Gold Prospector magazine about him. But it was a lonely thing, but it was fun, it was adventurous. A lot of guys went back to get money to pay off the farm. Some went to get rich. Most what they found when they got to the gold rush in California is they found they could find gold, maybe not in a quantity that would make them rich, but in a quantity certainly that was worth more than working on the farm in Indiana. The fellows that went to California made big wages. They lived high. But even a guy with a rocker box could make a half to an ounce a day, and that was $16 in those days when 50 cents was the going wage for a day's work back east. So that was high wages. An ounce of gold then would buy as much as an ounce of gold will today. Here's a fella in the gold fields with a crude set of scales weighing out the gold, and this kind of shows some of the fellas there at and ladies. There wasn't a whole lot of women that went on the California gold rush. It was pretty lonely for women, but there's a lot of towns built up. A lot of these towns exist today. Some of them are ghost towns. But the old-time miners left us a legacy that is just unbelievable. Here's one of their homes. He says he's a lucky miner's house, but no wife. So he was lucky with gold, but he had no wife to share it with. And like I said, they could make real good wages. Some got rich. Some guys would make 2, 3, 5 ounces a day, and that was just a real princely sum. It wasn't millions of dollars, but it certainly was what you could consider the best construction wages of today. And these guys went out to California and they saw the elephant, so to speak. They saw the world. They were no longer the country boy that had left Indiana. They were worldly, and when they got back from California into the factories in New York and the farms in Kentucky and different places in Georgia, they weren't satisfied. They were like somebody that had seen the world, and they had seen it, and so many of them moved back to California. This is a depiction of the frog jumping in Calaveras County, because the freedom, the spirit of America really grew out of the gold rush. That spirit of freedom. You know, the gold was free in every way. The guys that got into the gold rush, when they got there, the claims were free. The United States had the best mining laws that existed to get the minerals developed, because when you found it, the minerals were free, the gold was free, a mining claim was free, and men were free, with nothing more than a pick and a shovel and a homemade sluice box, or 2 or 3 guys could form a company, and they could go in there and really enjoy the fruits of their labor, and they had a chance to really make it. And that's why that there was so much enthusiasm about the gold rushes, and it didn't matter what color you were or what race you belonged to or anything, whether you were Irish or Dutch or German or African or Mexican. It didn't matter. All that mattered is if you were willing to work, Mother Nature would give up some of her bounty. If you weren't willing to work, you wouldn't get it. And that's the cruel hand that Mother Nature dealt these miners, and they went after it with zeal. This is the rush up to Alaska. This is Skagway in 1897. And showing some of the hardships that the guys went through in the different gold rushes. But on all these rushes, we opened up the West. We pulled out millions and millions of dollars in wealth. And this was real money. This was gold that the guys brought out and deposited within the banks and spent and stayed in this country. And it's still illegal to export gold from this country. And this is what made America strong and gave us that sense of fair play that is spread from this country and was developed of these gold rushes. And here's a guy mushing over the Dawson Trail and heading up over the Chillicoot or White's Pass and down the valley there to the headwaters of the Yukon River. And each guy going over had to take about 900 pounds with him, and they used a lot of dogs. They say there wasn't a dog left in the city of Seattle. Every one of them had been kidnapped, and a dog was worth his weight in gold almost. And here's some fellas using some steers to haul their sleds with. And of course, I'm sure when they got to Dawson, they took those steers and butchered them and got probably a princely sum for the meat. But a miner's word was his handshake. You know, that was back in the days, and still exists today with the prospectors out there in the country. You know, if you go out to the gold fields even today in North Georgia or California, you'll find that most of these guys, their word is as good as the gold, and there's still some real men and women left out there that are honest and hard-working, and that's what it's all about. And these guys were too, and it wasn't long before they built some fantastic cities, and these cities are still there, and they dug them out of scratch. And here's old Grandpa with his granddaughter up in the Klondike running his rocker box, and this guy, you can look at him and you know he's a kindly, hard-working gentleman that you can believe what he says. There's no phony yuppie about this crowd. They hiked over that Chillicothe Pass, and they say that it was so crowded going over that pass that if you stepped out of the trail, out of the line there, that it would take you sometime 2 hours to get your place back in. And this is some of the supplies that they deposited at the top of Chillicothe Pass. In the middle of winter, 20,000 women went over that trail. That's back before women's lib, and these were real women. These were women that took their own destiny and the responsibility for their own destiny, and the best kind of humanity that ever existed went forward and pulled that gold out. And this is a picture of Whitehorse back in the early days, and here's a guy digging in his claim. You know, 2 or 3 guys would get together and they dig a hole all the way down to bedrock, and then in the summer they would sluice the stuff out. And so he had his shaft there, and as soon as the weather got cold enough to freeze it up, he'd start digging down. And here's Main Street in Dawson, and this is what the place looked like as they carved it right out of the wilderness. And these guys weren't 1850s, these were 1900, and they made their boats and the lumber for building these towns with a misery whip. They didn't have automatic saws like we do today, and they didn't go down and pay $100 at the gym to stay in shape. And there's many guys that go out today and go prospecting in the woods, and if you go out there in the desert and you hike and you look for gold, boy, you're going to get in real good shape. And if you get lucky, you'll find a little poke of gold, and you can rekindle your heritage, because these people here, this great migration and gold rush, they left us a heritage. They left us a heritage of freedom, access to the land, love of the land, and hard work. And that's exactly what gold mining was then and is today. And anybody that's gone out and done any prospecting, they understand that it's 95% hard work, 5% luck. Sure, there's those few lucky Swedes and stuff like that you hear about that struck it rich. Most guys didn't strike it rich, but they did in a way, because they were enriched by the gold rush and by their experiences. This shows the boat going through the ice, making it to the beaches at Nome, Alaska. Nome was a windswept area that was good for nothing. Even the Eskimo wouldn't live out there in Nome. But here come a whole herd of gold seekers, blacks, whites, Mexicans, French, Irish, Eskimos joined in, and everybody for that search for that elusive gold. And they built a city there that's still there today, with a friendship that exists, a gold rush city, if you will. And here's the guys loading in off the barge, and they lighteraged them in, because there was no dock or no port or anything in Nome. They just lighteraged right in. There was a 40-mile beach with gold on it. Nobody could place a claim on the beach, so the miners had their own law, and they had a 20-foot stretch, and what they called the double shovel length was their claim there on the beach. And so they unloaded all sorts of equipment. They said that you could lay off the beach at Nome in a boat, and when you looked at the beach, it looked like it had snowed in the middle of summer because of all the white tents that was on the beach. They built all kinds of contraptions, because it wasn't long when they were there on the beach mining all this small, fine gold from the beach. A guy could mine an ounce and a half a day, and he still can today. But it wasn't long for them to decide that the gold had come in on the evening tide, because every time they'd have a storm, it would bring new gold into the beach at Nome. And so all kinds of contraptions and different devices were being developed, engineering that existed in those days, and the means that the guys had to go out and work out in the ocean. This is some of the advertisement that came from the newspapers in Seattle. It was the poor man's digging, American soil, 8 days from Seattle. And by what they meant by a poor man is you didn't need any capital. And then that was the gold rush. You didn't need a capital to get involved in it. All you needed to do was get there and get your pick and shovel and get your rear end in gear and get some hard sweat going. And by golly, you could make, and you had as good a chance as anybody. It didn't matter whether the guy was a prince or a pauper. He had the same chance when it came to the gold mines. And under the 1872 mining laws, when they developed, and it was just a great experience in humanity. And all the stories from the old timers in those days, it was tantamount of a world war without all of the killing, because the guys were there, and it was a real magnificent thing that happened. Dogs were worshipped in that cold country because not only would a dog be your best friend and pull your sled over the tundra, but if worst got to worst and you got down to it, you could even eat the dog, you know, and that really truly meant that dog was man's best friend. Here you see some miners in there doing some hydraulic, and they'd thaw the permafrost in the summer, and they would bring that material down and work it. And we had companies of men, and we also had guys working out on the beach. This is a guy with a surf box. The water would come in, the wave would come in and bring water in, and then it would take it out and would allow those guys to wash their gold out and settle it down on their carpet. And here's some fellows working rocker boxes with their rain gear on. A rocker box is a real simple device. It doesn't take a motor or anything, but boy, you can get a lot of gold with them. And here's another fellow with his idea. He would shovel a lot of material up into the header box, and then the guy with the bucket would wash it down the sluice and drop the gold in behind the riffles. And one guy could shovel as much material as he wanted, and then it would wash down in leisure. Here was what they called the California pump. The guy would get up there and hand crank that to pump the water up and the material, and the fellow would dump it up on that belt, and then he would feed it into those rocker boxes, and you see the guy on the left cleaning up the screen. This was a device that was developed. This is where they were going to put a coffer dam down and pump the water out and then work the ocean floor. This was another outfit where they were going to dredge the ocean floor. They were going to run this machine out into the ocean and dredge the material up, suck it up by the use of pumps, and run it over a series of sluice boxes. They're still developing equipment today, as we sit here and speak, to work in the ocean. Here's another guy that's running another pump. They call this the Oregon pump. And I can tell you the old boy up there supplying the power for the pump was getting his exercise. I'm surprised that they don't sell this as an exercise machine today. And the fellow with the shovel, he was getting some. Here's a picture of inside the bank at Nome, Alaska, and the big gold scales that there still exist. These scales are still in the Miners and Merchants Bank. And here's the three lucky Swedes with all the gold that they had sacked up and ready to take back to Seattle with them. And they had that all ready to go in those big sacks of gold, and that all looked really good. What we're going to take a look at now is I'm going to show you some footage from the 1950s, some footage that we acquired that shows some hydraulic mining and some big bucket line dredges. Because as gold mining developed, these big bucket line dredges come along and hydraulic mining. Now the hydraulic mining was where they took a giant and they washed a mountain down with it, and then they took the material and they run it through a sluice box and they just washed it through a sluice. Well, the nature of gold is that if you're using that much water, you're not going to settle out a lot of the fine gold, so it was a very inefficient type of mining. And also your very large nuggets was going to sink down in the bedrock and not be able to be moved with the water that you had. So the hydraulic mining was very inefficient, and it was environmentally a problem because it would wash down a whole mountain and flood that in and actually change the direction of a lot of streams. And so what they did is they did away with this kind of mining, and you can't get a permit to do it anymore. However, the gold dredges, the big bucket line dredges that came into vogue, they did work well because they floated in their own pond and were pretty environmentally sound because they didn't take anything out of the stream or add anything to it. They just worked in their pond. They left some big tailing piles along in Snelling, California, and different places that you can see today. But you can go back on these tailing piles with your metal detector and find those nuggets because most of these big dredges were inefficient and not set up to catch the nuggets. So let's take a look and roll that film now. Okay, you look at the violence of the water here, and the giant running. There's the giant washing the material down. And when you've got that much water, flowing through your sluice boxes, you're just not going to trap the fine gold because it simply will not settle out. So what they got is they got a lot of the big gold, but a lot of that gold would settle out even before it got to their sluice boxes. Here's what you see is a settling pond. They put settling ponds in even in those days to keep from the muddy water from getting in, and then they would pump the water way up the hill and then let it run down, or they would let it go up in a flume, and this would give them the pressure for their giant. And the giant was operated with a monitor, and then the guy could sit there and he had a box of rocks to give the ballast to it so that it was just very little. He could just take his fingers and run that around real easy and wash that gravel down. Now what this is a stacker. They'd have two of these, and one of them would use his to move the tailings, and the other guy would wash the material down. But you can see the violence in the water and the movement of the water, and he's washing it into the header box or into the head flume, and you can see that a lot of the gold, the larger gold, would drop out into the gravel, work its way on down to the bedrock when it loosened up, and then only a certain medium-sized gold would trap in here. And they use mercury in their boxes to try to trap that flour gold, but most of it wouldn't settle out, and it went right on through. And of course, we don't use mercury today. These practices have long since been outlawed, but the miners in those days did use it. I know that they have gotten a bad rap, and that a lot of people say that a lot of mercury was lost out of their boxes. But mercury's in the streams. It's a natural element. It comes out of cinnabar ore, and much of the mercury that you find out there is there naturally. These old miners are pretty efficient. They didn't lose a whole lot out of their boxes, but you can see that. And when you really talk about it environmentally, you can't hardly go back and find where these operations were. You know, they talk about washing down a hillside or something, but they were working placer gravel, and that gravel was deposited there from some gigantic flood that Mother Nature put in. And here the guys are pulling the rails out of the box. They put those rails down there to keep the big rocks from busting up the bottom of their box, and they'd pull those out. This film was made in the 1950s. Early 50s, and it shows when some of this was still going on, and then he would get in there with a sluice fork, and the sluice fork would pick out the larger rocks, and they would clean up the box, and this was called cleanup. And they do this generally once a year. They would wash down all summer long, and then in the fall they would do their cleanup. And you can see the gold there because there was a lot of work in this, so they didn't clean up every day. You know, we go out with our sluice boxes and stuff on the weekend, and the guy will get in there and he'll clean up every 30 minutes if he's a greenhorn. But generally, your old timers, they'll clean up once a day or maybe once a weekend. And back in the commercial operations, well, these guys, they cleaned up once a season. And here you see an operation getting ready for a dredging for one of the big bucket line dredging operations, and they had to go in and clear some land, and then they would take tests. They would drive holes down to bedrock and pull up samples with a drill. This is an old churn drill. We still use these kind of drills today, some of them, because they're accurate for pulling out the samples, and then he flushes that material out, and then what he'll do is he'll pan that to see what kind of colors he's got in there. You notice this guy's technique on panning. He's a real good panner, this fella, and this is the same kind of technique that you'll find in GPAA's panning video, the kind of techniques that we teach. And so then based upon that, they would decide whether or not they wanted to construct one of these bucket line dredges. And these are the pictures of it being constructed. It floated in its own pond, so it didn't interfere with the fish flowing up the river. And they would clear some land, and then they would go in and dredge the material with the bucket line dredge and take the gold out of it. I know a lot of people think that this is an awful thing, but the gold that come from a lot of this equipment has helped what's build our nation and the freedoms that we enjoy. And now we're putting some of it back to protect the environment, but they didn't do as much damage. This kind of equipment here was pretty environmentally sound because it just picked the gravel up, dumped it right out behind, and just pulled the gold out. And it didn't add any chemicals to it, or it didn't take anything away from it, and so it was pretty environmentally sound kind of mining to do. The thing that it did leave was some tailing piles, and these tailing piles have been worrisome and reclaiming them into pasture land. But gold is what kept this nation free and what helped us win the wars that we've been in because of the wealth, the real wealth that we have. And even today, the world trades in gold. And this is the stacker. This is the tailings would come up and stack into the tailing piles. And today, of course, if they do any of this kind of mining, they take bulldozers and spread those tailing piles around and plant the top of them, and you can't even tell that they've been in there. But years ago, they didn't have to do that. As a matter of fact, even the small miner today has to put up a reclamation bond so that he makes sure that any equipment that he takes out there will be removed and that the land will be restored. Here you see the guys bringing the gold in, the amalgam in. Now this is the gold that's coated in mercury, and here they're retorting the mercury off in a retort. Mercury vaporized at 550 degrees, and it would run off and cool in that water jacket, and then the mercury would drip back into the water. And when they open it up, this is the mercury dripping back in here. And then when they open this thing up, they'd have the gold in the inside of it without any mercury. So the mercury would be all cooked off of it. You got to be very careful with that because mercury vapors will kill you. And mercury is a dangerous thing. You know, you've heard mad as a hatter, and that's because they used to cure the beaver hats with mercury. And so the guys that made the hats would all go crazy. Well, we found out that that mercury will poison, and it's not good to have that. So you want to be very careful if you're working around this. This is his furnace. We use furnaces similar to that today to cook off mercury and to melt the gold. We put our flux in there, melt the gold down, and pour off the pure gold. You know, and many guys do this on a very small scale. I have my setup in my garage where I do that and pour my miner's bars. You can go out and collect the ore on your weekend and grind it up and refine it down and make these miner's bars. And boy, I'll tell you what, you got a 40-pound bar there, and it's worth a lot of money because there's 12 ounces to a pound of gold, and there's 40 pounds, and you can multiply that out. I think gold's selling $450, $470 today, so that's a lot of money, and it's real heavy. You know, the old westerns where they show a guy loading up his saddlebags with 100 or so gold bars and then riding off out across the desert. That's not the case. You put 100 of those on a horse and it'd break down the best horse in the world. He wouldn't be able to even walk with that kind of a load. So gold is very heavy. Here what we're going to take a look at is a real interesting part of this film. This is a couple of guys out working a hard rock. You know, most of the time we think of weekend prospectors only being able to work the gravel, the placer gravel. But what you see here is that you can find these quartz veins, and then this one here is very rich. It's got some gold in it. You can see the particles of gold. A lot of times you can't see the gold, but you'll find this white quartz, and if you crush that up with your mortar and pestle, as this guy's doing here, you can crush it up with your mortar. He puts a little piece of ore in there and he crushed it up. You can buy those mortar and pestles. They're pretty reasonable at Keen Engineering in different places. And then he'll take that material from the mortar and pestle and he'll dump it in his gold pan and he'll pan it. It's the same way you'd pan your sampling for your placer. So the gold pan is a real universal tool in gold mining. And so he'll pan that down and he'll count the little tiny colors because that gives him an indication if he's got free milling ore there. And then if he has, then he'll go to work on it. Some guys dig a hole back in. This is a one-man operation. He's got him a mine cart there, lay him down some rails, and he goes back in there and he gets his ore and he brings it out and dumps it. And then he'll run it through a little ball mill or a crusher. They've got the little jaw crushers today that run off of Briggs & Stratton engines. And a lot of this type of mining's coming back. Most of it's being done on private land. It's kind of hard to do this unless you have a mine. And here, some places, you can just dig it out with a pick. The rock is so soft that you can just dig it up with a pick. You don't need explosives or anything. You can pick it up and throw it in a pickup truck and haul it down. A lot of us take that material and we will leach it out at home, or we will grind it up and take the gold out of it. And there's many methods of doing that, and all of these methods, of course, are available to you through the GPAA, but these guys are they're just digging the material out of the bank, and gold has been found in every kind of rock there is, mostly often associated with quartz, but it can be found in common country rock like this, all different kinds of rocks. So you want to take your mortar and pestle with you and always be sampling that rock, because you never know what kind of rock that gold's going to be found in. Don't always under the conclusion that it's going to be found in quartz. And this is a ball mill. This is where they have it's just like a large rock tumbler. If you know what a rock tumbler is, one of these little tumblers that you get that's plastic that you polish rocks with. Well, this is a big steel tumbler. The thing you see there on the left is a crusher. It crushes, and then inside that drum is these heavy steel balls. And these balls dropping and rolling around inside will crush up the ore. And then they bring it out over what appears to be a sluice box without any riffles. Now, they're using a copper plate and coating that copper plate again with mercury, and the very fine gold will stick to the mercury, and then they will scrape that off. We recommend that you don't use mercury today. There's a lot of methods that you can use to pull the gold out where you don't need the mercury, because it is dangerous in the wrong hands. However, used properly, mercury is really the miner's friend. And I don't recommend it, because it seems like a lot of people have lost their ability for common sense today. And so if you tell somebody that he should, that mercury is the best way to do it, and he goes out and uses it and gets himself hurt or pollutes the environment or something like that, well, then a lot of times they will hold you responsible for him. So I don't recommend this. I've got other methods, and the GPA has other methods that they can show you. But what he's doing here is that he's scraping the mercury off. Now the gold will stipulate in there just like sandpaper, and he scrapes that off and puts it into that container, and then he retorts it off like you saw in the previous scenes. Here again is the two guys out there, and they're looking at this whole mountain contains gold ore. This old boy working underground here, he's probably following a quartz lead. Some of it you can just pick right out with a pick. You don't even need explosives or anything. It's soft enough. And here's a whole bunch of gold nuggets. And these nuggets, now these come from placer gold. This is different than your lode gold. Here's another fellow taken, and he's panning in the stream. What I want to show you now is, now that you've seen this, is I want to show you some mining from this film that we have from the 1920s. And this is absolutely remarkable footage. This shows some footage as early as 1900 in the gold rush in California. You see, many people think that the gold rush in California ended about 1855. Well, for all practical purposes, in a way it did, but gold mining continued in California throughout the 1900s, and still even exists today in some scale or another. Let me tell you that it's never died out in the hand scale mining. A lot of the fortune seekers, the guys that was destined, the despots and the bunco artists and all of those guys, they moved into the city and started other kind of business. The honest miners continued, and they still continue today. Maybe not in the numbers that they had then, but they still continue. And in 1900, they were still using the same tools and the same methods as they were in the 1850s. And we've got some real early black and white silent footage that we're going to show you at this time that depicts all of that type of mining. Was acquired by the Gold Prospectors Association of America some 20 years ago. It is a silent film produced in Hollywood around the 1912 era, shortly after the large gold rush to Nome and Kendall, Alaska. It's produced of the mining in the central Mother Lode district throughout California and that Mother Lode area. What you see in the film here is Grass Valley, California, and that area of the Mother Lode where a lot of underground mining took place. The film is historical in that it was done around the time when there was still a lot of hand mining going on, clear up until the 1930s. There was a lot of activity of mining in the United States, and this film presents it fairly well. Many of the scenes that you see throughout this old 1920s black and white silent film is unduplicatable today. Here we see a Hollywood rendition of a wagon train, but as we progress further into this film, you will see some of the actual prospectors and miners on the streams in California. What you're seeing here is the depiction of the gold rush to California and how the miners came west with the covered wagon trains and their mules and packs into the mother lode of California during the 1848 and 49 gold rush. In the next segment, we're going to take a look at some of the methods. This is a rocker box. Rocker boxes are still in use today. They're an excellent hand method. The rocker box, as you see there, the fellows using them, uses all of the good things in mining. They classify the material. They also control the amount of water that's used, and they're very efficient for pulling out the gold. Here you see an old-timer panning for gold, and if you look closely, you can see that this guy really knows his stuff when it comes to panning gold, and he's fairly fast with it. He's using the old metal pan, and he's whipping the material right down there. This guy really knew, this old-timer really knew what he was doing as far as panning gold is concerned. You can see that he's trapped the black sand concentrates with several nuggets in the pan. Here again, we're going to take a better, closer look at the rocker box. You see the guy shoveling the material into the hopper, the classifier on top, and he pours the water in, rocks the box gently back and forth, throws out the oversized material. The smaller material, which contains the gold, will go down through the classifier that he had, as you see right there. And it kind of washes through and washes the gravel, and the particles of gold will go down through that classifying screen and onto the sluice below. If you'll notice closely, the sluice that he's using in this box contains no riffles. Many people have a misconception about riffles that are needed in a box, but to save the gold, when you classify it down and you can control the water, and the pitching from side to side gives you a jigging action. There's many very expensive jigs available on the market today, but this does it naturally. The old rocker box does. Now we're going to take a look at some hydraulic mining that's shown. These hydraulic mines, when they used that, they used ground sluices, and then this is a ground sluice, and you can see the riffles there, just cut out pieces of wood. They took a tree and cut off large hunks of it and laid it in the sluice box, and as the material goes through, the current carries the larger and the lighter material out and allows the heavier material to concentrate down behind those blocks of woods, which form riffles. Just about anything will work as a riffle, and here you're looking out of the portal of the mine, and they take a hydraulic giant and just wash the whole hill down through these giant sluice boxes, and sometimes they would run 1/4 mile long. You see here the giant working. They had to have two monitors, one that would wash down the hill and the other one that would move the tailings around, because in these days they didn't use a lot of D8 caterpillars to push the stuff around. This is what we would classify today as open pit mining. Of course, this kind of mining isn't done today because of the amount of silt that it brings down into the streams. It's prohibited because it would cover up the fish eggs. However, it was an efficient way of mining gold. And one thing that this did do is it left the ground pretty much as it was found. By that I mean it didn't separate the gravels and the topsoil so that the nature couldn't replenish itself. You go back and look at the old places where they used the giants and the hydraulics, it's all grown over and the trees have grown up on it. Unlike the bucket line dredge that separated the material and left the barren gravel on top, and it takes a lot longer for Mother Nature to reconstitute that and bring back the vegetation. However, this kind of mining isn't allowed anymore, but it's really interesting as to how that it worked. They'd take the giant, they'd wash the hillside down, run it through the sluice boxes, and then they'd use another giant for stacking the tailings. This is the ground shortly after it was hydraulic mined. It's already started to reclaim itself. As you can see there, some of the brush is starting to grow back on it. Today, if you go into the mother lode, it's really hard to find these areas. And what's really important to the small-scale prospector today is that a ground sluice was very, very inefficient. When they brought the material down and washed it down through these gullies, they settled the gold all in the bottom of the gullies and did a lot of work for the small-scale miner today. And if you go back and can recognize these areas that were sluiced like that and ground sluiced, and go right back in where they left off. They concentrated a lot of gold in the bottom there that they did not get. That was a real sloppy, inefficient way of mining. However, it was good because they could move a tremendous amount of material. One thing that's kind of interesting in today's mining is the fact that if you took all of the small scale, or what we call recreational miners, and the amount of dirt they move in an entire year could be moved by a large-scale mining operation in probably one day, but yet the amount of gold recovered is about 10,000 to 1 as far as the gold that's recovered for the amount of yardage moved is so much more efficient with the individual prospector using his sluice box or his rocker box or something like that. This is looking at Nevada City in the old days. This is back in the early part of 1900, between 1912 and 1920. And you can see that there's been a lot of changes in the mother lode country, and this area has pretty much became a bedroom community for the Sacramento area. But there was quite a number of prospectors and miners living there even in that day and time. And this is Nevada City, and some of these photos this film is very rare. As a matter of fact, some of the mines that you're going to see and some of the underground workings don't exist today. Now, this was a picture taken in Nevada City when they still had some horse and buggies on the street and some old-time cars. And you can tell by looking at the cars about when this film was taken, and this is downtown Nevada City. Here you're looking at an outcropping of quartz containing gold in the mother lode, and when you found an outcropping where it had gold on the surface, when you went down on that outcropping, it could be a bonanza. This is the Mayflower mine, and all of these buildings, I understand, no longer exist. This was back in its heyday when it was fully operational. The Idaho, Maryland produced $30 million. That's at $16 gold, by the way. You can equate that out. I think gold is selling anywhere from $350 to $450 today, and so that's some 20 times the price that it was in those days. This is the fellows coming up the incline shaft that brought up the elevator that they used for hoisting them in, and material. They'd bring it up and dump the ore out, and then they'd run it down through a series of stamp mills, which we'll take a look at. This is the ore cart that he fills up from the bend, and that's the ore material. They go down in the mine and mine out the veins and bring the material up into this hopper, and then take it from there over to the mill where it would be stamped. Now, the film kind of splits here, and it goes back to showing an old-time prospector, and this is what a lot of people depict a prospector as. They don't see a guy out there with a four-wheel drive pickup and a Honda ATV and a 5-inch gold dredge or a sluice box or a dry washer or something. Most people have this sort of an image even today of a lot of prospectors and guys out in the desert. But it's really changed a lot as our entire world has changed, and that doesn't really depict the prospector today. But however, there are still some of those old-time miners out floating around in the desert, and I've been fortunate enough to run into a few of them in my years of prospecting, and when you do, you can sit down and they become very interesting. This guy, Mr. Foote here, he was quite a famous mining man in the mother lode, quite an entrepreneur. He developed a lot of the mines in the mother lode. He was a renowned individual for finding gold. There's no other live footage that I know of Mr. Foote, Arthur Foote, anywhere other than this film that you're looking at. We're taking a look now at some of the mines and the methods that were used in hard rock mining in the Mother Lode, and some of these methods are still carried out today. This is the drill, and what he's got laying there is he's got a single jack and he's got a automatic jack leg drill, and he shows that it's hollow down through the center. And today you'll find a lot of these around. These are considered antiques today in that they use a diamond bit for this drilling, but in that day it was quite a thing. Here you've got the old blacksmith hammering out a single jack or a hand drill and sharpening it. And they used those forges. We've been, the club, the Gold Prospectors Association, been lucky enough to acquire some of those old forges. We have one on our American Queen dredge up in near Nome, Alaska. This is the North Star mine, and they're showing a comparison of sharpening the bits. You saw there the old blacksmith. Here is the automatic stamp machine for sharpening the bits. And these are, of course, the automatic bits. And even those, like I said today, are almost considered antiques when you find them. Single jack, a man could do 30 blows a minute. Here you've got a guy there. He doesn't need to buy a membership down at the local gym. He stays in pretty good shape. This is a modern drill, could do 1,600. And we still use these. These are considered jack legs, where the guy sets it up. It runs with air. And like I say, today we have a lot more efficient methods. They will do a lot faster than that and go in a lot better. But these were the start of them, and they're still similar to that we use today, underground in the mine working a face, especially on a small scale. So what they do is they drill a hole, and then they place the charges or the dynamite in here. What you see here is a guy with a single jack drilling a hole, and a guy with an automatic jack leg drilling a hole in the face to place the charges. And of course it was a lot faster. Here are a lot of the timbers that went underground in the Empire Mine, and of course the Empire Mine today is nothing but a relic of itself. Very few people have been underground in this. The famous 16-to-1 mine is up in that area as well, and in the 16-to-1 mine, some of the columns underneath the ground there have gold that's visible laced in. They had to leave these columns in order to hold up the roof of the mine. And these columns that they left were incredibly rich. You can go in and actually see some of the gold in there if you're lucky enough to get in. This is the Empire Mine in 1850. This is a plaque that they put. That's when it was discovered. Here's some of the ore buckets. Now these are quite large ore buckets that run up and down the incline shaft down into the mine. And here's the workers coming up out of the mine. They brought them up. There was like just a couple of inches above their head that they came up, and these elevators brought them up real fast. The guy there was the boss, and he would tell them when to get off for safety. That must have been something working down underground like that back in those early days. People don't really understand all the sweat and hard work that went into building America, but a lot of those fellows right there are the ones that really helped make our country what it is today. And of course, gold has had a real stabilizing effect on our dollar, and our ability to produce gold has made our current currency liquid over the years. This is the ore going down into the stamp mills, and then it's ground up. A lot of fellas today even go out and pick up ore from the dumps, or they work the smaller veins, because these fellas, they needed large veins to work. Very rich veins were worked first. Today, we still in Nevada and California have a lot of ore that's being crushed up. We use different methods for crushing it than these old stamp mills, because they're pretty antiquated, but they did a real good job bringing it down to about 40 mesh. And then they would run it over silver or copper plates that were coated with mercury, and they would pull out the free milling gold. We also know that there was a lot of gold that's locked up in sulfides, invisible gold, and today many companies are working the tailings from these mines, pulling out the gold that they didn't get, because the only gold they got was the stuff that was liberated. After they crushed it up, it liberated the free milling gold, and then that was pulled out with the mercury into the copper plate. And after a certain period of time, they would take shut this off and take a scraper and scrape the mercury off of those plates, and then they would put new mercury on the plates, and the other mercury would be charged with gold, and they'd take that in and separate it out. And here's where they used the cyanide vats for pulling the gold out of the solution. We use a whole different method on the cyanidation method today, but the cyanide would dissolve the gold into a solution, and then they would bring it back out of the cyanide, precipitate it back out. And you can see here their vats and then their filters where they extracted the gold from the slime and precipitated it out and brought it back, and then you'll see where they fired it in the furnace and poured out the pure gold as we progress here. But this is the precipitant, and the precipitant then would be fired in the ovens. They mixed it with soda and sand and put it in. This is where they had it ready to go into the ovens, and then they would fire it, and this would bring the gold into a button on the bottom and leaving the slag on the top where they could pour it off and recover the gold. I know fellows that have gone out with their metal detectors today and found some of these old ovens, if you know what you're looking for. They're kind of hard to identify because most of them are broken up, especially the things that they carried the buttons in. There was a lot of gold residue left in them, and fellows go out with their metal detectors today that really are sharp and know what they're looking for, and they're able to locate some of these, and there can be as much as 100 or so ounces that some of them have collected just from stuff that was left. Because as you can see from this film, it was not a very clean operation, in that there was quite a bit of waste into the product there, and that you see that's molten, that's running out, that's gold that's pouring out in there with a certain amount of slag that settles to the top. And just the stuff off of the floor, a lot of people would be satisfied with just finding that, and a lot of that got swept out, and people with metal detectors find it today around the old things like up at the Lucky Baldwin mine in the San Bernardino Mountains. Lucky Baldwin, they run an operation similar to this with a lot of stamps up there, and it's a popular place where guys go, as throughout the Mother Lode and throughout most of the United States where there was any hard rock mining that took place. This 40 ounces or 40 pounds of gold is certainly worth a lot more than $9,600 today. You can take your pencil and equate that out. 40 pounds of gold, 12 ounces to the pound, and it's selling now for right at $400. This is some of the ore that I was telling you about, that some of the columns that exist in the 16-to-1 mine are almost that rich. You can see the almost pure gold protruding right through the white quartz rock that the fellow's showing there. And these are some very, very good samples. If you find samples like this, they're specimens, and they're worth far more than the current price of gold. The current price of gold for melted bullion is $350, but for nuggets or specimen gold such as you see here, you're talking upwards of $1,000 an ounce or better in most markets. And these are certainly some really tremendous specimens. I often wonder where these specimens wound up. They're probably in somebody's private collection today, but they existed at one time. They were mined out. Look at the gold that's all twisted. And some of the nuggets that you find come out of, well, all of the nuggets that you find in the stream panning come out of this sort of stuff. There's a nugget, and you can tell that it hasn't moved very far. It's got the sides pounded down a little bit. And here we get into the promotional part of the film. I was telling you earlier that this film was acquired by the Gold Prospectors Association some 25 years ago. It was originally produced in 1912 as to promote a gold mining venture. And I'm not sure what gold mining venture it was, but there's a lot of interesting data in here as far as gold mining investments, as the way they related to railroad and other investments in that day and time. And some Dun & Bradstreet reports. I'm not sure that any of this information is authentic, other than that it was produced back in those days, and we left it in here because we thought it was really kind of interesting. The railroads and the national banks were paying 6.5% interest on invested capital. Insurance was about 11, they say there, and lumbering was 14. Manufacturing about 20% paid on invested capital, and mining was 182%. I'm not sure that mining would be classified as that high today, but it's certainly worth a lot more than that for the guys that get into it. I know that the enjoyment that you get out of mining is certainly something, and that's the end of this old film. I hope you enjoyed it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you've enjoyed these films that we've put together here at the GPAA. I know we had a lot of fun putting them together, and there's a lot of things that if you go back and you look at this video again, it will dawn on you the type of mining that can be done. And I hope I've given you some secrets and some things that you can apply to your weekend prospecting. And I want to say good luck and get lots of gold. And we appreciate you getting this video, because you're helping the GPAA and you're helping us stay on the air with the Outdoor Channel and a lot of other good things for prospectors. So thank you again, and enjoy the video, and God bless. Thank you.